Hi, everybody. We're just giving folks a few seconds to get logged in before we get started. If you are already logged in, you can open up your chat window, and there's some information in there about how you can buy Mary's book and how you can get 15% off when you buy it through greenlightbookstore.com in the next week. All right, good evening, and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. We're excited to host tonight's event with Mary Morris presenting her new book, All the Way to the Tigers. She'll be talking with Dani Shapiro, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to everyone for making this happen and to all of you for showing up. Greenlight storefronts are currently closed, but our community is still here. Now, just a couple of housekeeping things. You can see and hear the speakers, but they cannot see or hear you. They can see your name over in our attendee list, and they'll see your name when you comment in chat or ask questions in our audience Q&A. If you scroll over the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see a couple functions that we'll be using throughout the event. One of them is labeled chat. You can use that to comment at any point throughout the conversation about what's being discussed. You can say hello to the authors, provide a little bit of virtual applause after the reading or during high points in the conversation. You'll also see at the bottom of your Zoom window an icon labeled Q&A. This is where we'll be pulling questions from during our audience Q&A portion towards the end of the event. You can type your questions there at any point throughout the conversation. And if you see someone else's question that you would really like to hear answered, you can go ahead and upvote that, and the questions with the most likes will float towards the top of our queue as we're pulling questions to ask Mary. We are recording tonight's event, so look for video or audio versions on our website and social channels later on. And tonight's featured book, All the Way to the Tigers, is available for sale from greenlightbookstore.com. Though our stores are closed, we're working with our supplier warehouse for fast direct-to-home shipping. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. And we're offering 15% off on the featured book when you purchase it from Greenlight's website in the next week. Look for that coupon code in the chat. Our interviewer for this evening is Dani Shapiro. She is the author of the New York Times bestselling memoir, Inheritance, as well as Hourglass, Still Writing, Devotion, and Slow Motion, and 5 novels including Black and White and Family History. Also an essayist and a journalist, Shapiro's short fiction, essays, and journalistic pieces have appeared in The New Yorker, Granta, Tin House, One Story, Elle, Vogue, Oh, the Oprah Magazine, the New York Times Book Review, the op-ed pages of the New York Times, and many other publications. She is taught in the writing programs at Columbia, NYU, the New School, and Wesleyan University. She is the co-founder of the Sirenland Writers Conference. Shapiro is the host of the hit podcast Family Secrets. She'll be speaking with our featured author, Mary Morris. She is the author of numerous works of fiction, including the novels Gateway to the Moon, The Jazz Palace, A Mother's Love, and House Arrest, and of nonfiction, including the travel classic Nothing to Declare, Memoirs of a Woman Traveling Alone. Morris is a recipient of the Rome Prize in Literature and the 2016 Anisfield Wolf Book Award for Fiction. She lives in Brooklyn. Her new book, All the Way to the Tigers, offers an elegiac, wry, and wise look at a woman on the road and the glorious, elusive creature she seeks. Mary is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then she'll be talking with Dani and with all of you. Mary, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Chelsea and Greenlight, and thank you, Dani, so much for doing this conversation. I couldn't do it. I'm thrilled that we're doing this together. I'm just going to read from the first chapter, and then I'm going to read a little bit from the chapter later on, favorite sections. India, 2011. We haven't moved in what seems like hours. It's late afternoon in January, and I can see my breath. Our Jeep is at a crossroads where my driver and guide sit in silence. AJ is listening, his eyes dart skimming the woods, but mainly he listens. I'm listening too, though I'm not sure what I'm supposed to hear. I've got 2 horsehair blankets across my legs, a hot water bottle cooling in my lap, and a scarf wrapped around my head. I'm shivering not only from the cold, but also from a fever and coughing from a virus that's sunk deep into my chest. As the sun is going down, a family of langur monkeys gathers in the trees. Something rustles in the bush, and there's chatter above. A bird with turquoise and black feathers that look like an evening gown flits through the forest. Another with 2 long purple plumes perches on a low-hanging branch. AJ points to the scat of an elephant in the road, but it's a tame elephant, one of the 4 used by the rangers to patrol these woods. A jackal bursts from the brush and crosses our path, but the tiger eludes us. It is the tiger everyone comes to see, not the snake-eating hawk, the spotted deer, the wild boar. It's all about the tiger. Sudhir, our driver, wants to push on, but AJ motions for him to be patient. AJ is listening. It is almost dusk, and the other Jeeps have called it a day. In fact, there are very few. I've seen almost no tourists. I'm alone with my driver and guide in this Jeep that holds 8. It's getting colder, almost freezing as the darkness settles in. I'm in the jungle, sick and cold, with blankets wrapped around my thighs, searching for tigers. We've been here for days without a sign, but AJ and Sudhir want to persist. It has become a point of pride. I've seen the beautiful birds, I tell them, the white-spotted and sambar deer. I've seen a jackal race down the road and monkeys mocking us from the trees. I don't need to see more. But it seems that I'm the only thing in this jungle they will not listen to. Slowly, AJ raises his hand. He's whispering to Sudhir. He listens, then points, and now both men are pointing in different directions. What is it, I ask? As always, I hear nothing. Sambar deer alarm call. She's warning the spotted deer. Suddenly we are off as Sudhir zigzags along the twists and turns of the rutted dirt road. I bump up and down in the back, holding the frame as we approach a fork. Go right, AJ mouths, his hand waving Sudhir on. We race down into a big meadow surrounded by trees. Once more we stop and the men stand up. AJ borrows my binoculars. He scans the meadow, focused on some movement in the brush. In there, AJ says. She's somewhere in there. AJ explains that all unseen tigers are referred to as she. The tiger hidden in the brush is always she. We wait for her to move as we stand still. There's an eerie quiet in the air as we sit watching. Using my hand as a visor, my eyes scan the woods as well. She's out there, I have no doubt. My guide knows too. We are silent and the jungle around us is quiet as we wait for the bushes to rustle and the tiger to emerge. She's crouching in the tall grass that hides her stripes, but I'm willing to wait. In my own way, I've been waiting a long time. As a child, I had a tiger dream. I had it often and it was always the same. There is a tiger at the foot of my bed. He sits on his haunches, sharpening his claws on my bedposts. I stare at him. His claws extended, focused on his task. He is never in a hurry. His amber eyes are on me. When his claws are sharp, he gets into a crouch as tigers do, and he pounces. He springs through the air, and just before he lands on top of me, I wake up. Years later, I learned that you cannot dream your own death. But it never occurred to me that the tiger meant to kill me. He had something else in mind. Thank you.
Mary.
Dani.
That was wonderful. And I'm having such a sort of full circle experience listening to you right now. And I feel like sharing with everybody who's here with us in their own solitudes, as we all are.
Yes, we are.
That you and I met in 1993 at Nan Talisa's holiday party. That's a long time ago.
I believe Nan is with us, so let's say hi, Nan.
Hi, Nan.
1993. I was trying to remember, Dani. What book was it for?
It wasn't a book party. It was a holiday party.
Holiday party, right? Okay.
But you were either just bringing out or had just brought out The Waiting Room, your novel.
Yes, yes.
Nan was publishing a very early novel of mine called
Was it Fugitive Blue? It was Fugitive Blue, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
And your daughter, Kate, who is now about to have a baby herself, was basically a baby. I mean, she was like 6 years old or something. And
She was, yes, she was. I think she was at the party, actually.
she was at the party. I met her there. And so I'm just thinking about the fullness of time and the fullness of time in a writer's life. And I really feel like this memoir is a sort of capstone, I don't know how else to put it, on your travel memoirs. I don't want to say capstone because my guess is you'll write more travel memoirs. But when I think about your work, which I knew before I ever knew you and admired before I ever knew you, your first book was short stories, and then you wrote Nothing to Declare.
Mm-hmm.
And then you wrote a novel, and then you wrote Wall to Wall. Right. And then you've moved fluidly between fiction and memoir. You know, when I met you, I never thought I was ever going to write a memoir.
Oh, that is so interesting.
That
is really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I was a novelist, and that's what I thought I would always do. And now I'm sort of half and half memoirs and novels, as you are, more or less.
Right.
And I just want to start by asking you, what do you call yourself? When people say, what do you do? What do you
sometimes people say to me, are you Mary Morris the novelist, or are you Mary Morris the travel writer? And,
right. I think they're two different people.
It's interesting, Dani, because our trajectory has been so similar and parallel in so many ways. You know, for me, it's all about the story and what story do I want to tell and how do I want to tell the story. This is the fifth of these solo travel memoirs, and you're right to call it a kind of capstone, because I feel that from Nothing to Declare to this book, I mean, each book marks a different moment in my life as a solo traveler, and I don't know what the next solo journey might be. This was a trip I needed to take for my own personal reasons and then write about. But this marks a certain moment. I don't know what the next, I think I might do a gardening book next. I don't have a journey in mind. And also, although if I could just share something in terms of a writer's process, because a student and friend of mine gave me this incredible journal as a gift, I think in January or I can't remember, maybe it was last fall. And it's a big journal. And I thought, well, I don't know when I'm going to use it because it's so big and it's so beautiful. And the minute we went into the COVID lockdown, I began writing about everything that was happening in that journal. And now I've almost filled it. I need a new one. And I think that as writers, we don't, like, one of the things with my travel books is that often I write them years after the journey. And I think that as writers, I think for journalists it's different, but I think as memoirists, we need to process our material, and we don't know how long that will take or where it's going to take us. I'm amazed at how quickly and beautifully you wrote Inheritance, because I think that book just poured out of you in a certain way. And again, I may be wrong about that, but
well, there are journeys that are foisted upon us, and then there are journeys that we take.
Yes,
exactly. And then there are journeys that it turns out were always the journey we were on and we didn't know it. But, I think, you're talking about the difference between memoirists and journalists go into a story knowing they're going to write about it.
Right.
And I think that a difference is that we don't take the journey to write the book. The writing of the book becomes an outgrowth of the need to have taken that journey, or right. The layers of
the journey takes us to the story rather than the story. We don't know where that's going to take us.
Right. So we're not led by the story. The story is there to be discovered. And
And it's often in the detour, Dani, right?
Right.
Not
Right.
in the, if I could just say a thing about the tiger book, because one of the ways the book begins, of course, not of course, but I know it begins this way, is that in 2008, I was going on a sabbatical and I was going to be a nomad for a year. And the first day of the sabbatical, I fell and broke my leg, and I know I didn't go anywhere. And that was a major detour. We're all in a big detour right now. And it was during that period in 2008 that I read Death in Venice, where I read the line, he would go on a journey not far, not all the way to the tigers. And I remember Easter Sunday sitting on my couch feeling sorry for myself. And I read that line and I thought, I'm going to go to the tigers when I can walk again. And, we don't know where, we're going on one journey. I was worried about jury duty that day. And instead I was laid up for months. And, we don't know where it's going to take us. And I think that we just have to, I don't know, we have to take our raw material and see when it will become subject matter, if at all.
Yeah, and that is on its own timetable, not on our timetable, sadly.
Yes.
Sadly for us.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about the trajectory of All the Way to the Tigers from, let's just say, from the time that you were laid up on your sofa to now? What was the journey of this book for you?
Right. So it's really interesting, and it's one of the reasons why I really deeply wanted to do this conversation with you, because you so helped shape what this book became. Initially, I decided that there were journeys. So there were several journeys that I actually took before the journey to India. I went to Morocco and Istanbul, all of these different trips. And I wrote a 420-page book that had India in it, that was called All the Way to the Tigers. I mean, I'm being very frank with everyone about this. It was very long, and nobody was really interested in it. It didn't get published. And you offered to read it, and it was after you read it and you said, if it's not about you or your family or the tigers, take it out. And, I loved it when you said that I seemed to flow seamlessly from one book to another. Well, the internal struggles of all of that flow. So I took a 420-page book and rendered it the way you render soup or sauce into less than a 200-page manuscript. And that was really, in part, that came out of our conversation, but also the feeling that, so I'd written a linear narrative, right? I'd written a straight narrative. And then I got rid of all that. And I wrote this book that became a very different narrative. But it was a very different process, obviously.
Yeah.
It took years. I mean, the accident was in 2008. We're in 2020. I think I wrote India was in 2011. I think the first draft was in 2013. So it's a long journey, it's a long journey.
Well, the patience of discovering what belongs with what. I mean, there's so much patience that's required, and writers are, if anything, like the most impatient people on the planet, like doing the thing that requires a tremendous amount of patience, a tremendous amount of waiting to see how do these things fit together. And one of the things that you and I talked about recently is the way that, I mean, the phrase that I've been using is that in the last decade or so, I feel like I've broken up with narrative. Like it's just, I stopped, in my early writing life, if you listen to what people tell you about yourself, people were telling me that was my gift, was I knew how to create narrative momentum. And at some point, probably around 2008 or so, I just took that tool out of the toolbox and went like, I'm done with narrative momentum. How can I create it in a different way? Because the idea of a seamless, lovely, fluid narrative arc stopped feeling true to me.
Right.
We don't live seamless narrative arcs. Like just what you were saying about you got up that morning where you broke your foot, you were planning on, your biggest worry was jury duty, and you were going to just ice skate a little bit and get on with your day. And then the narrative did not go seamlessly for you. And
Right.
those seams are where the art happens, I think. So I'm wondering, because All the Way to the Tigers is a book that takes place in like multiple layers of time.
Mm-hmm.
How did you find that structure for it?
Let me go back to patience for 1 minute and just say one of my favorite quotes, and I keep it above my desk, is from Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet, where he says, patience is everything, gestation is all. And again, that has to do with gardening for me, is we learn how to make things grow as writers, and how we do that. And that you can't, I'm sure there are writers, I would love to be one of them, that sit down and write the first page of a book and then they continue on. And I remember once reading an interview with Jenny Ofel, where I think there was actually a picture of all these little tiny slips of paper that she had all over her desk, and just trying to figure out where they all were going to go. So one of the decisions I made when I went back into this book, once I realized it wasn't going to be, I was going to break up with narrative. I love the idea of it because it's like you're dating narrative, and you decide, you know what, I'm going to break up with you and I'm going to do something else. And there was a moment where when I made that decision that I love to share this because no reader will ever figure this out, but I wanted the book to actually, the form of the book to actually be like a tiger. So I wanted these short little chapters that were like stripes. I wanted these little longer chapters, but then I wanted these short chapters. And I decided I had to have an even number of them because a tiger is like a Rorschach test, and a tiger has an even number of stripes, the exact same stripes on every side. So once I kind of had the idea that the book itself would be a tiger, it gave me a form to play with. And I suppose, I started as a poet, and I suppose it sort of comes out of, I feel more drawn to sort of the language and the transitions. And Dani, transitions is something you do so beautifully, is how to go from one moment to the next. And that doesn't have to be, that's not a linear, it's intuitive and associative rather than linear.
Yeah, I know. I love that word, associative.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about it a lot because when we think about the way that our minds work, like I'll sometimes say to my students, just try following your mind. Just try and see how chronological or linear that goes. Because our minds are, well, especially these days probably, but they are like a jumble of associations and not all, what?
And distraction.
Well, and
right?
Distraction for sure, but the work of the writer is to make art out of those associations, to see the way that this belongs with that. Or when it comes to, this is something I've thought of in recent years, and I wonder what you think about it, because again, as someone who moves between fiction and memoir, I think if you're writing a novel and you're thinking to yourself, oh, I really like this metaphor, you are, pardon my French, but you are fucked if you are thinking, I really like this metaphor, and you're writing fiction, because the magic of fiction happens in that unconscious place or that subconscious place where later readers will say, or critics will say, or maybe later we will understand that that thing was a metaphor, right?
Right.
But in memoir, I actually think part of it is recognizing the metaphor in our own lives. And so, or as Dolly Parton once said, like, figure out who you are. And I know I'm quoting Dolly Parton, figure out who you are and then do that on purpose.
Oh, I love it.
It's like for you, the tiger was a tiger and the tiger was a metaphor.
Right.
And those two little juxtaposed chapters that you read when you got to your girlhood bedroom and that dream, that you would have often, that was you, the writer, connecting that thought that you had when you were on your sofa and laid up and read that quote with a long ago memory, probably something that you never thought you would ever do anything with. It just
Right.
hadn't even occurred to you, right?
Well, what's really interesting what you're saying about the whole fiction and metaphor. I think the minute you think, oh, that's a great metaphor, you're going to lose the story. And what
Right.
keeps a novel going, as John Irving once said, is that your job as a fiction writer is to make the reader turn the page. You have to keep the story moving. Whereas, I think for me, it's not that I don't write fiction in a linear way necessarily, but I think that memoir, at least for me, and I believe for you, is more modular and it's more metaphorical. And honestly, when I decided to go look for tigers, I literally was going to go look for tigers. I didn't expect that a tiger, an unseen tiger, was always a she. I didn't expect this female association. I didn't expect to feel that a solitary apex predator referred to as she would somehow, I would somehow identify with that as a writer. I feel like a solitary apex predator sometimes. And, there were a lot of things about the tiger beyond the physical reality of a tiger that became the metaphor for the tiger. And I think you're right that works in memoir in a way that in fiction, it weighs it down. It doesn't mean that the metaphor is not there, but if that's what you're thinking is like really working, you probably need to back up.
Well, in fiction, the metaphor may be there, but if the writer is conscious of it, then the writer is self-conscious.
Right.
And that kind of self-consciousness is kind of the enemy of good fiction.
Right.
But in memoir, I think, look, I feel people so often misunderstand memoir as a form. Critics misunderstand it and they review the life. Readers misunderstand it and think they're reading your journal sometimes.
Right.
But good memoir is the act of transcending your life and being able to see it, see an aspect of it. You as a multiple memoirist and me as well. I mean, I've contended with the question, oh, you're too young. Well, I'm not too young anymore, but like when I was 30 something, you're too young to be writing your memoirs. It's like, I'm not writing my memoirs. I'm telling a story. And
Right.
It's not because I think my life is interesting. It's because I want to use my life in service of a story that I want to tell. And
Right.
I think that that's what enables you, Mary, to have written this body of work in memoir that is not revisiting the same, journey twice ever. It's about looking at a life over the course of a life as it's being examined and understood by its protagonist.
Right. This is so interesting, Dani, because, one of the things that I feel when I'm writing these memoirs, I don't feel that I'm writing about myself. I feel that it's a character. You called it a protagonist. I feel that I'm writing a narrative that is personal to me in the first person, and there's a story involved. And I think the reason that readers interface or connect to certain memoir is because it connects to them. When I read your memoirs, when I read Inheritance, it's such a beautiful book. The way you talk about fathers and your relationship to faith and all of that, it's not just you talking about you. I feel a connection. Michael Chabon once said that a story is the shortest distance between two brains. That the way we connect is through our stories. And so I think that, I think certainly there are memoirs, we all have had people come to us and say, oh, I've got a story for you to tell. I've got a story to tell. But it doesn't mean that they're really going to be able to tell that story in a way that's going to connect with other people and readers. And just for me, when I'm writing these books and when I wrote this book, I didn't really think of it as being about myself. I thought of it being about someone else.
Yeah, which is the way that Vivian Gornick has this cold phrase, but it's of interest to the disinterested reader about memoir. And I mean, a reader might approach a book optimistically, but really the reader is disinterested until the reader is made interested. And that kind of understanding of that, I think, is what connects. I want to read you something. Yesterday I interviewed Jenny Finney Boylan for an upcoming episode of my podcast, and she said this amazing thing. And for those of you who don't know, Jenny Finney Boylan, author of amazing memoirs, She's Not There, most recently, Good Boy. But Jenny is trans, and here's what she says. The hardest thing for people who aren't transsexual is to be compassionate and have the imagination to recognize that this is the defining crisis of someone's life. If you're trying to live in a body you're not wired for, it's like paddling upstream against the current in a tiny boat. Because people who are not transsexual have never had this problem, they assume it must not be a problem. If you're not trans, you wake up in the morning and don't worry what sex you are. For people who do have to worry, people for whom it's a constant, agonizing heartbreak, others think it's funny or strange. It's a measure of our compassion as human beings. Can you understand the problems of someone who is not you?
Mm.
And like, I just had chills when I read that,
Mm-hmm.
because it feels like that is the work of connecting in that way, is there isn't the assumed connection. The assumed, well, this happened to me and I'm going to tell you about it and therefore you'll understand. But the work, the language, the modules, as you were talking about, I think going back to the breaking up with narrative, the way in which when you break up with narrative and there's white space on the page, you're suddenly actually allowing the reader in. The reader becomes like, inhabits that space a little bit and has to make those connections for herself, which gives the reader agency in the story.
Right. I'm thinking about what Jenny said about can you understand the problems of the other? And I find that so touching to right now, particularly in this moment that we're living in, is the need to understand the problems of the other, but also that we're all human and we're all the same. And that I think for me, by reading memoir and reading books that move me, is that I connect to the humanness and the humanity of others in a way that we just can't do it over dinner in the same way. You know, there's a depth and attention that we bring to our writing and our reading that allows us to feel close to another person. I think it's one of the reasons why when people read memoir, they think as if they know you. And I always love that Borges poem or little vignette, Borges and I, like there's Borges who gets the mail and he's that Borges. And then there's this guy in his slippers and pajamas who's like trying to write something, you know, with his coffee in the morning. And I think that, you know, that people have the outside view and then there's the inside view. And I think so much of what we're trying to do is just understand each other. Really, it's not even that difficult to understand that, right?
Right.
We write to connect.
And isn't it, I mean, it's interesting and moving and confusing that we're living through these dual moments right now of the pandemic and Black Lives Matter that actually feel like they're happening simultaneously, and that the degree to which people are having their own personal reckonings in part is happening because, I mean, it's long overdue, but there's space for it. And
that's really interesting.
Like, look at the way that we are right now. Like, I'm in my office in Connecticut. My dog's around here somewhere. My husband's downstairs, like banging pots, you know, to make dinner.
Right.
And
I'm in Brooklyn. My husband's upstairs running a newsroom.
Right. And like everyone, we're getting these windows into each other's lives where it's not polished and it's not well lit or perfect. And, you know, we're seeing on the news every night, the talking heads with, you know, their bad lighting and, you know, bookcases and pictures of kids and,
Right,
you know,
right.
pets running. And there's something that is allowing, I think, all of us, this combination of slowing down and looking inside, and these conversations are strangely intimate. Like you and I, if this were like before times, we would be sitting at green light and we would, you know, I mean, we both dressed up a little bit, but we'd probably be dressed
A
up
little
all
bit.
over our feet. And we would be having this conversation with all of you who are listening, being in the room, or, you know, those who could come to the bookstore being in the room. And now we're having this other kind of conversation and people are listening, but it also feels really intimate, like a conversation
Right.
that's being listened to.
Right. I mean, you know, a lot of things I think about what you just said that's really interesting is that I think we do have a particular moment right now to reflect and be, you know, we're in a terrible time of social upheaval, and reckoning. And at the same time, we're dealing with the pandemic and, you know, how do we, and probably, you know, you're right that if it was a different moment, that the convergence of those things is very powerful. If I could, you know, go back to the book a little bit, one of the things about All the Way to the Tigers is that I was housebound for 3 months at a time when I thought I would be traveling the world. And that instead of traveling every day, I canceled plans and I took a detour here. I didn't go anywhere, you know. And one of the things I really felt about that moment looking back, I felt sorry for myself. I felt deeply sorry for myself. And at this moment, I've never been more productive. I feel connected in ways that, you know, I take time for friends, for thinking, for reading, you know, really looking at what people are talking about this moment, that we're very distracted and yet we're not distracted. And it is a good time. I mean, that's why I really recommend to everyone, if you haven't started your COVID journal, you should start it now. Or just writing down what you're feeling and what you're going through and the kinds of things. You know, my daughter is 7 months pregnant, and until a week ago, we had to social distance because Larry and I hadn't quarantined long enough, and we would do this bizarre social distancing dance upstate, where, you know, outdoors and all of that. And just, but I think you're really right that this is a moment of where we can pause and we can reflect and we can do better. We can all do better, you know.
I
And
think
it's
before,
time to write if you you know, for those of you who want, well, if you can, you know.
I think before we open it up to questions,
Yeah.
I just want to say that I think that your book has a quality of, I mean, there's real solitude in your book.
Yes.
There's a really powerful and palpable sense of a woman traveling alone, which is something you've always done so brilliantly. And I think it's a great novel to read during these times when we are, you know, I can't speak for anyone else, but that feeling of being separate, you know, not adrift at all, but, you know, enclosed, and with, for many of us, even if we are surrounded by people, a powerful sense of solitude during this time. And
One of the things about the book is, in a way, it's a dual solitude, because there's the solitary traveler and then there's the solitude of being really stuck at home.
mhm.
You know, the dual narrative between the accident and the journey. And I think we are all experiencing a moment of solitude, and some handling it better than others. But you know, I do think for writers and artists that there is you know, there are some positive things that are coming out of it. But we are face to face with our own solitude right now, and that is something that I think Memoir can touch upon and also bring more connectedness to people in reading it, reading more, you know, that you can feel connected to another person's solitude, another person's challenge, another person's sense of feeling othered, all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great place to open this up to some questions. And there are people clamoring to ask questions. Patty Dan, hi Patty, asks, the book has such an interesting structure. The trip to India, your recovery, and your childhood. Did you always have that structure?
Thank you, Patty. No, I definitely didn't always have, well, as I said, first it was the linear structure. But even then, I didn't always have this structure. I think I really began the book, I did begin the book with my accident. When I condensed it down, I began with the ice skating accident. And then I essentially, you know, one of the things that I do as a writer is I write in many different pieces. I don't write in order, so I write in pieces. And then I often, and I think I did it with this book, I know I did it with this book, I will print out all the different pieces. And something I do sometimes, and I did it with this book, is that if I have different time frames or different characters, I will print those on different colored paper. So maybe I would have printed the India in green, and maybe Brooklyn was in yellow, and maybe childhood was blue. And then I would have, and then there are the tiger pieces that maybe were purple. I'm just making up the colors. And then I would put them all on a table. I used to go to the New York Public Library to the map room because there were big tables at the map room. And if I actually took a map down from the map room and pretended to be looking at the map, they would let me spread my manuscript all over the giant tables they had. And I would move the colored pieces around until I felt that the colors were in the right scheme. So if I had too much yellow, I would say, no, I need blue in there. I need childhood in there. I've got too much tiger. So I was always moving the pieces around. And at one point I decided that it had to begin with India because that was really where it began for me. So the answer, Patty, is no, I didn't always have the structure, and that I like to, you know, it's kind of, it's moving, it's a puzzle, you know, and I do recommend the colored paper.
That's so interesting, Mary, because it's also, you sketch a lot, and it's not surprising to me, but it's just interesting that using a kind of visual, tactile, you know, visually artistic process would be helpful to you.
Yeah, it's very helpful to me, yeah.
Faith asks, Mary, where were you in your life when you were doing this travel? By the way, it's LNEM. No, I'm sorry. I conflated two things. Totally conflated two things. What is your biggest hurdle and the biggest moment of triumph during the process of penning this particular story?
Biggest hurdle and biggest triumph?
Mm-hmm.
So I think the biggest hurdle was when I wrote 420 pages of a linear travel book that I was really quite attached to. And I gave it to my friend Dani Shapiro, who said that, you know, there's too much stuff here. And I really had to think about what I needed to let go of. And I let go of a lot. I let go of over 220 pages, probably 250 pages. So that was a hurdle. And I think many writers have to face that reckoning of letting things go. And also the biggest triumph was, I think, when I saw the pieces fitting together and I said, wait, this could work. You know, this looked like a mess. You know, I often feel as a writer that someone has come and dumped a moving van full of stuff in my house. And my job is to sort it out and figure out where it's going to go. Mm-hmm. So once I kind of had a moment and I thought, you know what, I think this could work. And then, you know, and then it's a dream. And then you're just writing. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So this goes back to the colored pieces. Robin asks, Mary, when you move the colored pieces around, is it the colors that guide you or is it the text?
It's both, but so one of the things with this book is I knew that I didn't want too much tiger. I didn't want too much childhood. I didn't want like a big chunk of my mother in the middle of it. So yes, it's the text, but it's also about keeping the flow. The flow had to move between 2008, my accident, 2000, 11, the trip to India, childhood, and tiger memorabilia. And those are the 4 layers.
Mhm.
So yes, it's the text, but it's also realizing that's too much of my mother, or, it's enough of family. People are going to want to come back to India. So, I might put in something about my family and then I'm back in India. It's
And
really about a balance,
Well, and what you're really talking about is crafting and shaping the story, and
Right.
and which is like figuring out what to leave in and what to leave out is so much the work of writing memoir, and not getting carried away with your own interests even. Cherise asks, were you aware as you were writing and revising how wonderfully funny certain parts are, and how you're able to combine pathos of family life with the absurdity of it?
To be honest, Charisse, I don't even know. I guess I don't even know that it's funny right now, but I can see where some of it is funny. I think it's more. Okay, just an example. My daughter's dog upstate had a close encounter with a porcupine. That definitely in the happening of it was not funny, but in the telling of it, it's hilarious because of what happened, and how apparently a porcupine turns around and, like doing a can lifts its skirt. I didn't know that. So there are things that become funny in the midst of, and I think if we don't bring humor to it, I mean, I think one of the really funny moments is when I was really sick and miserable in India, and I kept trying to take a shower and not realizing that the hot and cold waters were reversed throughout the whole hotel. So I thought it was only a cold water hotel. So I think those moments become funny in the telling, but actually when you're going through them, less funny. But I like humor. I think people need to laugh.
So Caroline Levitt, hi Caroline.
Hi, Caroline.
Caroline asks, for Mary, what is the thing you miss most about your journey to the tigers? I loved the book.
I think what I miss most is I would like to go and look for more tigers. I for various reasons, and to be completely honest, part of it was financial. I was only able to do this one trip for this one period of time. I mean, it was a 3-week trip. I was on my own. I'm looking for tigers. I would love to continue the journey. I would love to know more. In some ways, I miss this book, and I miss that piece of it. But as writers, when we move on. So I think if someone offered me, I wanted to go to Siberia and look at the Siberian or Amur tiger, but I just wasn't able to do that. So, I hope that answers your question, Caroline.
Let's see. Claire asks, I have never read your books, but I'm so excited to dig in. Do you recommend that readers start with an author's first book? I need to know what to order first.
Well, I, of course, would start with this book, since it's the one out right now.
Isn't it also, though, Mary, isn't it also because I think we most are in love with the book that we have just written or are writing. And it's such a strange and interesting, almost kind of heartbreak for a writer. Like if somebody says, I loved XYZ, the book that you wrote 20 years ago, there's a little bit of a feeling of, oh, that's really lovely. But now, this is.
Someone once asked Picasso what his favorite painting was, and he said the next one.
Yeah.
And I love that, because I think that's how I feel as a writer. I mean, I've never reread any of my books once I've published them. My daughter Kate was reminding me of the fact the other day that Johnny Depp has never seen a single one of his movies in its entirety. Now, I don't know if Johnny Depp is a model that I necessarily want to subscribe to, but I think we're always moving forward with our stories. But going back to Claire, try this one, or one of the novels.
Can you speak, Lori Gardner asks, can you speak to loneliness versus solitude?
Hi, Lori. I've known Lori since kindergarten.
No.
Yeah. I think solitude is a choice, and loneliness is a state. And I think that loneliness can become solitude if we can accept it. But that feeling lonely is a very painful feeling. But solitude can be a very beautiful and expansive feeling. And I do think that they're different. And I feel that for me as a writer, solitude is a choice that I make pretty much every day. And then there's a moment where I don't want the solitude anymore and I want to see friends and have drinks and go out. But loneliness, I think, is something that is foisted upon us.
Mm. That's a beautiful answer.
Thank you.
Jacob Marquez asks, Mary, what is your favorite novel of yours that you have written and why is it your favorite?
Do I get to say the next one, Jacob? I will say that the book, and if my editor Nan Talese is listening, I thank her every day for this. The novel I spent 17 years on, The Jazz Palace, was really a book that I think more than anything, it was the book that wouldn't go away. It was the book that I had to keep writing, and it was the book that I absolutely loved writing. Probably because it had a lot to do with my family, because it was about music and jazz in Chicago, and it took me home. And I don't know if it's my best book, but it's definitely, it's a book that I loved. I loved working on it. Yeah.
Barbara Stark Neiman asks, do you see novels and memoir as some sort of continuum with regard to story and our personal subject matter?
Could you read that again?
Yeah.
My dog just pounded on the door. Could you read it
now? Do you see novels and memoir as some sort of continuum with regard to story and our personal subject matter?
I'm not 100% sure I completely understand the question, but if I do understand it, for me, novel or memoir is all about story. If you have to be telling a story, but I'm not sure that I'm really answering the question. But there's always a story.
I think the person asking it may mean, has it been a continuum? Like, do novels pick up where the memoirs leave off in some way, or are they really different? Are they different animals for you?
You mean in my own work?
I think so.
Yeah. I think, so to speak, animals. I think that they are different. They are very different for me. Once I had to read all of the work of Margaret Atwood, and I read it in order for a Paris Review interview. And what was really interesting was her poetry, books of poetry, clearly were places where she worked out her ideas, and the novels were where she executed them. And I really loved, like, there was a time when she was really obsessed with sort of women and gender. I mean, she's always been obsessed with that, but women and gender, and then you get The Edible Woman, or more political, and you get Bodily Harm. So it's just a very interesting, and I do think for me, I think I love writing novels, but I also love those moments of, when I can write, I don't know, memoir is just, I can breathe a little more easily with memoir.
Mm.
Yeah.
A question from me. Have you ever had a book change on you where you thought that it was going to be a novel and then it became a memoir, or you thought it was going to be a story and it became an essay, or like, have you had that sort of shape-shifting quality to any of your work, or does it really kind of announce itself as what it wants to be?
No, not at all. I mean, it changes all the time. One of the novels that I wrote that I loved is a book called Revenge, and it's the story of a young artist who wants to get back at someone, and she lives down the road from a world-class novelist. And I love that book. And the story of the novelist and the painter was an appendage to a much longer novel that didn't work out. And then in that big novel, which was a really complicated novel, and it had to do with like Egyptology and all of this stuff, and I don't even know what, it had to do with somebody, you know, a woman who was an objects conservator at the Metropolitan. Anyway, it doesn't matter what it was about. But what I came out of it was this appendage that became Revenge. The Jazz Palace was originally an 850-page novel that my agent, Ellen Levine, loved. And Ellen sent it out many, many, many times. And it wasn't until I had a eureka moment and I shrank it down to a much smaller book. So, I mean, there's a question of transformation. You have to allow for transformation. You can't say like, this is what I'm going to do and go do it.
Yeah.
But for me, the worst thing for me as a traveler is give me an itinerary.
Yeah.
If you say to me, this is where you got to go, I'm not going there.
Yeah. I love that. Because
Mhm.
basically you're saying like, let's not have a literary itinerary. You know,
Exactly.
it's such an important thing for
Right.
people to
Be a
hear.
traveler. Be a literary traveler, not a tourist.
Mm-hmm. So Charisse also asks, you revised and cut around 250 pages. Would you want to use those pages in something else?
It's really interesting. I had the same question asked with the Jazz Palace, because the Jazz Palace was 850 pages and half of the book happened after the end of where the Jazz Palace ends. And people said to me, well, why don't you publish that as a separate book? And afterwards I went back and I looked at it and I said, no, you know what? I was right to let that go. Now it's possible that one day I'll go back and I'll look at these pages and maybe I'll publish them as travel pieces or essays, but I think, I don't know, it's kind of like clothes, or, you know, things I've been doing a lot of getting rid of debris lately. And I think it's just, you get rid of it and you keep, you know, I always think of Vermeer, you know, those very few beautiful paintings where just, you keep the precious.
Mm-hmm. I love that.
Yeah.
So this might be the last question, and I think it's an appropriate person to ask it. So Nan Talisa asks,
Yes, Nan.
Mary, hi Nan.
Hi, Nan.
Mary, will you write another travel book? This feels like a journey that is finished, question mark. Is it, question mark? Nan.
Nan, thank you for that. Let's just say, whatever the next journey is, I don't know it now.
Yeah.
But I also would like to say that in 1986, Nan and I were sitting in a restaurant having lunch, and I was stuck in my work. And the New York Times had just published their summer travel issue, and it was all books by men. And I was kind of complaining to Nan and saying, oh, I don't understand, you know, why is it just men writing about travel? And she said to me, Mary, you're gone all the time. Why don't I never know where you are. Why don't you write about travel? And it had not occurred to me until Nan said that to me. And I went back into my old journals, and Nothing to Declare was already in my journals from 1978. And this was 1986. So I don't know what's in those books. I don't know what's in those journals. I hope there are future journeys. Maybe I've already taken them. Maybe I'm taking them now, or maybe I'm taking them in this great big journal that I'm writing now. But Nan, yes, I hope there will be other journeys and other books about them.
I love that. I love that. All right, I lied. One more question.
Okay, cool.
This is from T. Kira Madden. Hi, T. Kira.
Kira, this is like, it's like a part. This is a part.
Really nice. I wish we were all.
I wish we were all in the same room. Yeah. We will be.
Yes, we will.
One day.
T. Kira asks, how do you find the right ending? Does it differ between memoir and fiction?
Oh, that's such a good question. Well, one of the things I like to say to my students, and Kira was one of my students, and now she's an extraordinary memoirist and beautiful writer, and also extremely politically and socially committed person. And I really respect you for that, Kira. One of the things I always say is, if you don't know your ending, go back to your beginning. Look where you started and see if there's something in the beginning that is going to take you to your ending. And that is always what I've done with every book. whenever I don't know where I'm going. You know, many short stories I put aside because I didn't know the ending. And then I would go back to the beginning and I would think, oh, there's a dog in the beginning and something has to happen with the dog, or there's something there. There's a thread that I haven't come to the end of. You know, people say, how do you know when a book is finished? And I say, when I can't look at it anymore. And that's kind of partially true, but I also think it's that we've completed a circle, and there's no formula for that. There's no magic way of finding that, but, you know, go back to your beginning.
I love that. It's a perfect way of ending tonight, and also of reinforcing the idea of metaphor right there, what you just said. There it is, Mary.
Thank you.
Congratulations on the launch of this beautiful memoir. It's been a total joy to have this conversation with you tonight.
Thank you for doing this. This was a wonderful conversation. I've loved it.
Thank you both, Mary and Dani, for tonight's beautiful conversation. And thank you again to everyone who virtually came out tonight. Reminder, in case you missed any part of it or you have friends or family who missed it, that tonight's event has been recorded. So keep an eye out for it on our website and our YouTube channel and social later on. And a reminder that you can buy All the Way to the Tigers through Greenlight. And if you buy through our website before June 18th, you can get 15% off with code TIGER. Thanks so much again, everyone, for a lovely evening with all of you, and have a great rest of your evening. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.